She was forced to marry the outlaw gunslinger, but he protected her like his own heart. The sun hammered down on the valley with the relentless weight of an iron anvil, turning the air into a shimmering curtain of heat that distorted the horizon. It was a high, dry heat, the kind that sucked the moisture from a man's throat before he could even think to swallow, and it baked the earth until the soil cracked like old pottery. Holt wiped a forearm across his brow, the sweat stinging his eyes, and looked out over the miles of scrub brush and sage that constituted his sanctuary. He was a man built of hard angles and silence, living on land that few others wanted, in a territory where the law was often just a suggestion written on paper that took weeks to arrive. He was known in the nearby townships as a man best left alone, a gunslinger who had traded the noise of the saloon for the solitude of the range, though the pistol on his hip remained as much a part of him as his right hand. He was repairing the north fence, stretching barbed wire with leather-gloved hands, the metal groaning as he pulled it taut against the cedar post. The rhythm of the work was his only companion, the strike of the hammer, the rasp of wire, the dry buzz of cicadas rising from the grass. He preferred the company of horses to men. Horses were honest about their fear and their loyalty. Men were complicated, and their words usually hid motives that only came out when money or lead was involved. He squinted against the glare, spotting a plume of dust rising in the east, a brown smudge against the pale blue sky that signaled an arrival he had been expecting with a heavy, resigned dread. It wasn't a marshal, and it wasn't a friend. It was a transaction coming up the road, a debt being settled in a way that sat like a stone in his gut. The wagon rattled and creaked as it pulled into the yard, the horses coated in a fine layer of white dust, their heads low in the oppressive afternoon swelter. The driver, a man with a smile too wide for his face and eyes that darted like nervous flies, pulled on the reins and brought the rig to a halt near the water trough. Holt did not move from the porch where he now stood, his thumbs hooked into his gun belt, his face a mask of indifference. From the back of the wagon, the driver helped down a figure that looked entirely alien to this harsh brown landscape. She was small, though she held herself with a spine of steel, dressed in a traditional Cheong Sam of vibrant red silk that seemed to burn against the muted tones of the desert. This was Mailin. She was 25, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, elegant bun, her face pale and composed, despite the heat and the indignity of her situation. She held a small bundle of belongings to her chest, her knuckles white. The driver approached Holt, waving a piece of paper that fluttered in the hot wind. It was a deed of transfer, a cruel piece of bureaucracy that effectively sold a human life to settle a gambling debt her father couldn't pay. Holt took the paper, his eyes scanning the legalese without reading it, knowing the reality was far simpler. He looked at the driver, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "You're done here. Water your horses and ride." The driver's smile faltered under Holt's gaze, the distinct lack of hospitality clear. Holt turned his attention to the woman. She did not weep, and she did not look at the ground. She looked straight at him, her dark eyes assessing the man who was now, by the twisted laws of the territory, her husband. There was fear there, deep and sharp, but it was walled behind a fortress of dignity that Holt found himself instantly respecting. He nodded to her, a single, sharp dip of his chin. It was not a welcome, but it was an acknowledgment. The interior of the cabin was a reprieve from the blinding sun, though the air inside was still and heavy with the scent of pine pitch and old coffee. Holt held the door open for her, watching as she stepped across the threshold, the red silk of her dress whispering against the rough-hewn floorboards. It was a bachelor's home, functional and sparse. A cast-iron stove dominated one wall, a sturdy table with two mismatched chairs sat in the center, and a narrow cot lay in the corner. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the shuttered windows. Mailin stood in the center of the room, clutching her bundle, looking like a rare bird trapped in a wooden cage. Holt moved to the stove, pouring water from a pitcher into a tin cup. He offered it to her, his movements slow and deliberate, designed not to startle. "It's not much," he said, his voice rough from disuse, "but the roof holds." Mailin took the cup, her fingers brushing his calloused hand for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric in the silence. She drank, the cool water visibly reviving her, then lowered the cup. "I can work," she said softly, her English accented but clear. "I do not expect charity." Holt looked at her, seeing the set of her jaw. He had expected tears or hysteria, the reaction of a woman dragged from civilization to the edge of the map. Instead, he found resolve. "No charity here," Holt replied, taking his hat off and hanging it on a peg. "Just survival. You take the bed. I'll take the loft." He pointed to a ladder leading to a small platform above. It was a concession of comfort he hadn't planned on making, but looking at her standing there in her red silk, surrounded by his rough existence, he felt a strange protectiveness stir in his chest, a need to shield that bright color from the gray harshness of his world. The days that followed were a trial by fire, the summer heat intensifying until the very air seemed to vibrate. They moved around each other like ghosts in a small space, learning the choreography of cohabitation without speaking more than was necessary. Mailin did not complain about the heat, though Holt saw the sheen of sweat on her neck and the way she fanned herself when she thought he wasn't looking. True to her word, she worked. She took stock of his meager pantry, finding ways to season the beans and salt pork with herbs she found growing near the creek bed, turning bland fuel into actual meals. The red chongsam, impractical for the labor of a homestead, was carefully pinned up to keep the hem out of the dirt as she swept, scrubbed, and organized. Holt watched her from under the brim of his hat as he worked the horses in the corral. He saw the way she didn't shy away from the spiders in the corners or the grit that blew in under the door. She attacked the grime with a quiet ferocity. One afternoon he found her struggling to lift a heavy iron pot of water from the well. He stepped in silently, his large hands engulfing the handle, lifting it with effortless strength. She looked up at him, startled, and he saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes. "Heavy," he stated, setting it down near the stove. "Leave the heavy things for me." She nodded, wiping her hands on a rag. "I must pull my weight," she insisted, her voice firm. "You do," Holt said, looking around the cabin, which was cleaner than it had been in 10 years. "You make this place a home. That's weight enough." It was the most he had said to her in 3 days, and the admission hung in the air, a fragile bridge between two solitary islands. The isolation of the ranch was usually its best defense, but in the lawless expanse of the territory, nothing remained hidden forever. It was near dusk, the sky bruising purple and orange, when 3 riders crested the ridge. Holt was in the barn oiling a saddle when he heard the heavy thud of hooves in the yard. He moved instantly, the transition from laborer to gunman seamless and terrifying. He stepped out of the barn, his hand resting casually near the butt of his revolver. The riders were drifters, dusty and looking for trouble, their eyes already fixed on the porch where Mailin was shaking out a rug. They leered, seeing a woman alone, a woman who looked exotic and vulnerable. "Well now," the lead rider sneered, a man with a scarred lip and a cruel laugh. "Look what we found out here in the nothing. Pretty little thing for a dirt farmer." Mailin froze, her eyes widening, but she did not run. She stood her ground, the rug clutched to her chest. Holt's voice cut through the yard, flat and cold as a tombstone. "You're trespassing." The riders turned, seeing him for the first time. The leader laughed, though it sounded nervous. "Just being neighborly, friend. Asking the lady for a drink." One of the men nudged his horse forward, closer to the porch. Holt didn't shout. He didn't bluster. He simply drew. The motion was a blur, too fast to track, and suddenly the heavy Colt was leveled at the rider's chest, the hammer cocked with a sound that echoed like a cracking bone. "She isn't a lady for the likes of you," Holt said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a lethal promise. "And this is the only warning you get. Turn around, or you don't leave at all." The air grew still, the only sound the nervous stamping of a horse. The riders looked at Holt, saw the absolute lack of hesitation in his eyes and the darkness that lived there. They saw a man who would kill them without blinking to protect what was behind him. The leader spat, wheeled his horse, and galloped off, the others following in a cloud of dust. Holt didn't holster his weapon until they were gone. He turned to Mailin. She was trembling now, the adrenaline fading. He walked to the porch, holstering his gun, and stood between her and the road, a living wall. "Go inside, Mailin," he said gently. "I've got the watch." Night descended on the valley not as a relief, but as a heavy velvet shroud that trapped the day's heat against the earth. The encounter with the drifters had shifted the atmosphere of the homestead, charging the silence with a kinetic tension that made sleep impossible. Holt remained on the porch long after the moon had risen, a silent sentinel seated in a cane-backed chair, his rifle resting across his knees like a dormant serpent. He was watching the tree line, his eyes acclimated to the dark, scanning for the unnatural break of a branch or the glint of metal in the starlight. Inside, Mailin lay on the cot, staring up at the rough timber beams of the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic creak of Holt's weight shifting outside. The fear of the men had faded, replaced by a profound curiosity about the man who sat between her and the world. She rose quietly, the floorboards sighing under her bare feet, and moved to the stove. The embers were still glowing, casting a faint, demonic red light across the room. She heated the coffee pot, the smell of roasted beans strong and grounding, and poured 2 cups. Pushing open the door, she stepped out into the sultry night. Holt didn't jump. He had heard her coming since she left the bed. He watched as she approached, the moonlight turning her red silk into a shade of deep maroon. She held out the cup, steam rising in the stagnant air. "You cannot watch the dark forever," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Holt took the cup, his fingers brushing hers, lingering a moment longer than necessary. "Darkness has a way of moving when you blink," he replied, taking a sip. "I don't intend to blink." Mailin sat on the edge of the porch, wrapping her arms around her knees, looking out at the vast, terrifying emptiness of the west. "Why?" she asked simply. "You owe me nothing. The paper says you own me, but you treat me as a guest, a burden." Holt looked at her, his profile sharp against the stars. "A man who treats a person like property ain't a man," he said, his voice rumbling low in his chest. "And you ain't a burden, Mailin. You're the first light this place has seen in a long time. I protect what's mine. And I don't mean that like you're a horse or a plow. I mean, you're under my roof. That makes you my heart's worry, whether I ask for it or not." It was a clumsy admission, rough around the edges, but it settled deep in her chest, warmer than the coffee. The following week brought a heat that was almost malicious, a dry, suffocating blanket that turned the scrub grass into brittle tinder. The rhythm of their life had changed. There was a synchronization now, a silent language of nods and glances. But Holt was restless. He knew the drifters were symptoms of a disease, not the disease itself, and he knew he could not be everywhere at once. One morning, after the chores were done, he walked to the mantel and took down a heavy revolver, a smaller caliber than his own, but deadly nonetheless. He motioned for Mailin to follow him. They walked out past the barn to a dry ravine where the earth bank provided a natural backstop. Mailin watched him, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "The world is hard," Holt said, checking the cylinder of the weapon, "and I am only one man. If I fall, or if I am away, you cannot be defenseless." He handed her the gun. It was heavy in her small hands, cold and smelling of oil and steel. She looked at it with trepidation, then at him. "I do not like violence," she admitted. "Neither do I," Holt said, stepping behind her. "That's why we learn to end it quickly." He moved close, his chest pressing lightly against her back, his hands covering hers to correct her grip. The intimacy was sudden and overwhelming, the scent of him, leather and sage and sweat, enveloping her. He was a mountain of a man, solid and unyielding, yet his touch was incredibly gentle as he adjusted her elbows. "Breathe out," he murmured, his breath stirring the hair near her ear. "Squeeze. Don't pull. Let it surprise you." She focused, her heart hammering against her ribs, sensing his heartbeat against her spine. She fired. The kick was sharp, dust puffing from the bank. She missed the target, a tin can on a fence post, but she didn't drop the gun. "Again," Holt said, his voice steady, anchoring her. They spent an hour there, the sun beating down, until her arms ached and her ears rang. When she finally sent the can spinning into the air with a metallic clang, a rare, genuine smile broke across Holt's face. It transformed him, softening the hard lines around his eyes. "Good," he said, nodding with respect. "You have the eye." Mailin lowered the gun, looking at him, realizing that he wasn't just teaching her to shoot. He was giving her back her power. He was handing her equality in the form of lead and steel. The climax of the summer arrived not with rain, but with wind, a hot, howling gale that rushed down from the mountains, whipping the sagebrush into a frenzy. It was the kind of wind that drove men mad, carrying with it the scent of ozone and disaster. Holt was in the north pasture checking the herd when he saw it, a column of gray smoke rising rapidly against the blue sky, expanding outward like a blooming bruise. A grass fire. It was the rancher's nightmare, a beast that consumed everything in its path. He spurred his horse, galloping back to the cabin, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. "Mailin!" he roared as he skidded into the yard. She was already on the porch, eyes wide with terror as she watched the orange line of flames cresting the ridge, moving with terrifying speed toward their home. "Get the sacks!" Holt shouted, leaping from his horse. "Soak them in the trough! We have to dig a break!" There was no time for fear, only action. Mailin abandoned her dignity and her silk for the raw desperation of survival. She ran to the barn, dragging out burlap feed sacks, plunging them into the water trough, her hands numb with the shock of the cold water against the searing air. Holt was already at the perimeter, a shovel in his hands, digging furiously into the dry earth, throwing dirt to create a barrier. The fire roared like a freight train, the heat becoming physical, a wall that pushed against them. Mailin ran to him, dragging the wet sacks. Together they fought the line. She beat at the creeping flames with the wet burlap, coughing in the thick, acrid smoke, her eyes streaming. Holt worked like a machine, his shirt soaked with sweat, his muscles straining as he smothered the larger tongues of fire with dirt. They were a single unit fighting for their sanctuary, fighting for the life they had just begun to build. At one point, a burning tumbleweed blew past the line, catching the corner of the corral fence. Holt lunged for it, but Mailin was faster, throwing a wet sack over it and stomping it out, her boots black with ash. He looked at her through the haze, seeing not a delicate flower, but a warrior forged in iron. The battle lasted for what felt like hours, though it was likely less than one. As the wind died down, the fire turned back on itself, running out of fuel against the breaks they had cut. The roar faded to a crackle, then a hiss. The landscape around the cabin was charred black, a moonscape of smoking ash. But the house stood. The barn stood. They had won. Holt dropped his shovel, his chest heaving, his face streaked with soot and sweat. He stumbled toward the water trough and sank to his knees, splashing water over his head. Mailin stood nearby, her red dress ruined, singed at the hem and stained dark with grime. She looked at the blackened earth, then at Holt. The adrenaline crashed, leaving her trembling. Holt stood up, dripping wet, and saw her shaking. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and pulled her into him. It wasn't the polite distance of the kitchen or the instructional proximity of the shooting lesson. It was a desperate, claiming embrace. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, smelling the smoke and the sweat and the life of her. Mailin collapsed against him, her hands gripping the back of his shirt, sobbing dry, silent tears of relief. "I have you," he murmured into her hair, his voice cracking. "I have you. It's safe." He pulled back slightly, his large, rough hands cupping her face, his thumbs wiping away the soot from her cheekbones. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a duty, but as the only thing in the world that mattered. "You fought like a hellcat," he whispered, a wondrous disbelief in his tone. "You saved the barn." Mailin looked up at him, her eyes bright and fierce. "It is my home," she said, her voice raspy from the smoke. "And you are my husband." The word hung there, no longer a legal term, but a truth. The morning sun rose over a blackened world, but the light was soft, filtered through the lingering haze. It was a new day, in every sense. Holt sat on the porch steps, whittling a piece of kindling, not carving, just making shavings to busy his hands. He watched Mailin emerge from the cabin. She had bathed and changed into a simple cotton dress she had sewn from fabric scraps, the red silk folded away like a memory of a past life. She brought 2 plates of biscuits and sat beside him, their shoulders touching. The air was still and quiet, the birds beginning to return to the unburnt trees near the creek. Holt took a biscuit but didn't eat immediately. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the piece of paper, the deed, the contract, the proof of the debt that had brought her here. He held it up, letting the morning light shine through the cheap paper. "This burned up yesterday," he lied, though the paper was clearly intact. "In the fire, just ash now." He struck a match on his boot heel and held it to the corner of the document. They watched in silence as the flame curled the paper, turning the legalese and the debt into black flakes that drifted away on the breeze. Mailin watched it burn, feeling a chain break in her chest. She wasn't free to leave. She was free to stay. She turned to Holt, seeing the question in his eyes, the fear that without the paper she might go. She reached out, taking his scarred, calloused hand in hers, interlacing their fingers. "The fire took the past," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "We build the rest." Holt looked at their joined hands, the contrast of her pale skin against his weathered darkness, and nodded, a slow, deep acceptance settling over him. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture of reverence, of a man pledging his heart to the one thing he would die to protect. "We build," he agreed. And in the quiet of the morning, amidst the ashes of the old world, the gunslinger and the survivor began the work of living.